You want entrepreneurs, they got to live somewhere. We're going to talk about housing and maybe a touch of power today on Builders Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wick, the co-founder and CEO of Technically, the new organization and entrepreneurs. It's the monthly Builders Live. But first, the setup. Housing. I suspect you've heard a thing or two about housing. Maybe you know it to be. And maybe you think it's only local to you because just about anywhere, any degree of economic activity over the last 5 years has seen housing prices outpace incomes. So that has given us a whole set of conversations around the affordability, and that backs its way into talking about workforce, entrepreneurship, and where are people going to live. We're going to do all this work. So that'll be a theme of today's Builders Live: housing, maybe a little bit of power at the end. And to do that, I'm joined by two familiar faces and a new face: Victor Hwang of Right to Start, Brackeen from Lightship Capital, and my dear new friend, Rae'Mah Henderson of Techstars. By introduction, thanks for being here, the three of you, by the way. Love it. Yeah. Well, should we do that? Rae'Mah's, preaching. Let's start off with our classic. Give me a bright light and ecosystem building of the moment. And Victor and Brian, let's give Rae'Mah a break and she can go last. Victor, Brian, what's a bright light and ecosystem building you've seen of the moment? And welcome to the stage.
Well, I'm going to shout out Raleigh, North Carolina. Just yesterday, Right to Start launched its Starters Coalition, our on-the-ground grassroots coalition in North Carolina. We had an event. The mayor of Raleigh, Janet Cowell, showed up. State Senator Jay Chowdhury, who's been introducing and supporting a lot of pro-entrepreneur legislation in the state legislature. And the Chapel Hill mayor, Jess Anderson, showed up. So we had two mayors and a whole bunch of other leaders and entrepreneurs in the community showed up. So that was exciting. And then tomorrow we're kicking off the New York Starters Coalition. I'm here in Buffalo, New York, and we'll be kicking that off. I'm very excited for that too. So people that want to come in the morning, we've got an event happening in Buffalo.
Cheers to that. Congrats on those new coalition states, Victor. Brian, what's a bright light you've been seeing?
So right now, the Raleigh Innovation Conference going on in Indianapolis, our neighbor here next to me in Cincy. Great ecosystem, great state. A lot of things going on there. It's Salesforce's second largest office in the world is in Indy. People don't realize that. So good time if you're in the Indy area. And by the way, those don't know, Indianapolis has beautiful canals like Venice right downtown.
Wow. The bold Venice to Indianapolis comparison. Thank you, Brian. Rae'Mah, you want to shout out any bright light you're seeing and say hello, by the way, to the good people.
I know. Well, hello for you guys. I'm so excited to be joining, these brilliant minds in here. I already feel like I'm going to be learning something from you guys. So super excited to be here. Let's see, a bright light that I've been seeing. I want to give one. I tell you what, I'm going to cop out this time. Don't blame me, guys. I'm going to come back next session with a really, really good one.
No, it's going to be great. I'm already ready for it. So I'm already ready for next time. But so Rae'Mah, you are the bright light. How about the organizing that you were doing in Birmingham, Alabama, which we'll hear more about, is going to be our next time. I put Rae'Mah on the spot. So Rae'Mah.
I know.
Rae'Mah,
I was like, I don't want to be biased by shouting out my own city first.
Well, I think that's okay because that's part of we're all doing the work too. That's the point. So I am not going to shout out my hometown, so now I'll feel badly about that. But the good people in Bozeman, Montana, I was last week. I think I previewed this maybe a month ago, but last week I was in Bozeman, Montana for the Headwaters Tech Hub Summit, where they gathered a good number of the Tech Hub leaders from around the country, in addition to the Montana community. The Montana Headwaters Tech Hub Summit Headwaters Tech Hub is focused on photonics. It was really interesting to see some of the Tech Hub leaders from elsewhere in the country talk about how photonics, lasers for ease, can impact so many other portions of onshoring advanced technologies. So really interesting to see the mix of science and entrepreneurship playing on a campus in a Mountain West state like Montana. So shout out to the good people of the Headwaters Tech Hub and Summit. Okay, those are some bright lights. Let's talk a sec about housing. Brian, Victor, and Rae'Mah, you guys can keep me honest here if I start going off the rails, but I have a case that housing was not something that we had technically covered a whole bunch in the 2010s, other than every place we reported was constantly saying how cheap it was. That was like everyone's thing was, oh, housing is so affordable. Come live in our city, in our region. Last 5 years, I'll pull up some data here in a second. Housing has outpaced incomes in nearly every one of the largest metros. Housing costs have gone up. So relative to where you have been the last few years, housing might feel real expensive. Lots of structural reasons we can get to. But I think this has impact for entrepreneurial engagement, ecosystem building, workforce conversations. So first and foremost, call me a liar if you must. But Rae'Mah, Brian, Victor, talk to me a bit about, is housing showing up in your world and ecosystem building? And maybe Rae'Mah, I'll come back to you first. Are you seeing it in your ecosystem building work?
Yeah, so it's so interesting at Techstars. Every year you get these group of founders and you somehow bamboozle them into being a part of your program. And of course, the catch is like, hey, you guys got to live here in Birmingham, Alabama for 3 months. And so we're always talking about housing. And the cool thing is, we happen to have a startup here that happens to be an apartment startup. So it's like, okay, there is some options there, but it's costs at a premium, right? So when you're talking about $2,900, $3,200 a month for, an apartment. But the thing that a lot of people are normally talking about when they look at Alabama is like, oh my gosh, you have such cheap cost of living. Our incomes do reflect that though. So there is like the ratio is balanced. The interesting thing I will say is like, of course, we do still have like cheap housing and things of that nature. But like I mentioned earlier, when we were talking in the debrief room, I bought a house a couple years ago for 91 grand, 3 bedrooms, wow. 2 baths, fully renovated. My friends in San Francisco were very jealous. And now the same houses in that neighborhood are now going for 250 to 300, which is like a steep increase for us. But like you said, it's relative to what you think is expensive.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull that data, but Rae'Mah, that's a great kind of use case. If it's depends on what you're comparing to, right? If you're still going from expensive center to low cost center, you might say, what are you talking about? Housing is still less. But if you've been in a place over the last 5 years, you probably have felt it. We have the data to show it. Maybe Brian, throw it to you. Like, you've been housing, is this part of a conversation on entrepreneurial ecosystem building, or am I stretching the truth?
Stretching the truth. No, I'm kidding.
I mean, yeah, say it. Make the case, my friend.
No, it is a big deal. I think there's no correlation between the great deals and an entrepreneurial ecosystems, right? Like I've just shared with you kind of like a Zillow listing of a house in Cincinnati. If you were starting a company for $330,000, you could own a 3,300 square foot, essentially what we would consider like a mansion, right? In certain parts of the country.
Yeah.
Right? But we don't have the best ecosystem, right? So this is telling you right here, just because you have some good housing options doesn't mean that you're going to have the most dynamic ecosystem. And quite frankly, San Francisco has some of the worst housing options and it has one of the best ecosystems.
Yeah. So Victor, before I throw, actually, no, Victor. So like, I want to pull up some data here, but before I do, you're my sage word guy of wisdom.
Well, that doesn't say much for you, but
housing is it serious? Am I forcing it, or is this part of the conversation of entrepreneurial engagement?
You're forcing it. No, right.
Well, you guys keep joking. I don't know, maybe.
No, it's a big issue in the big cities. I think the major metro areas. It's a case where the rich get richer and it gets harder and harder in the places that have been successful. And so I've seen it. I mean, the Bay Area was not that expensive in the 90s. Like, the Silicon Valley was not that expensive. I mean, it was. I get back then, maybe people thought it was a little expensive, but it's not like it is now. Now it's just sort of out of reach, and there are places, and so there's been a whole movement in these places, like the YIMBY movement, right? Yes, in my backyard,
yep.
Which is around trying to lower the regulatory barriers or permitting, and a lot of the people fighting it are actually people that normally you'd think of as left, because they like their lifestyles and they don't want to have construction in their neighborhoods. So the YIMBY movement's a big deal in a lot of these big cities, specifically for the housing issues. I think there's still plenty of affordable housing in mid-sized cities in the country relatively. I mean, it's higher than it was, as Rae'Mah says, but it's still relatively affordable, even for people, doing, people working or starting new businesses in normal jobs. They can still afford to live. Yeah, so I think it's an issue in some places and more of an issue in others. So yeah, I think it's a nuanced issue, and it's probably not as bad as a lot of people think it is in some cities.
Okay, so we're going to dig in. I'm going to come to you, Victor, on any kind of like policy thoughts, which I often lean on you that can be pro-entrepreneurial on the policy side. But let me pull up a couple things to try to make my case that housing should be part of the pro-entrepreneurship agenda that so much of us are working on. Now, a couple things to lay the foundation that you guys all kind of alluded to, that obviously this is all relative, right? So one way this shows up in the data is we talk a lot about incomes relative to costs. And so there's like lots of the compelling research that throughout much of the late 20th century, if you were an hourly wage worker in, let's say, custodial work, or you were a high income salaried employee, let's say in legal, or even in what we would have then called high tech, it made great sense for you to relocate geographically, that Americans should have moved from lower cost centers to higher cost centers because the income earnings was there. So even though you're going to pay more for housing, you're going to get you were going to pay more for housing, you were going to get paid more for your employment. So it made sense to relocate. And it was like a big engine for where we saw population growth. The research is starting to show that's breaking down, that now that trade isn't always true. And so I have seen, smart people like Brian Brackeen and Victor talk about relocating out of high cost centers. Embedded in that assumption of saying, oh, maybe you should move away from SF or New York, embedded in that assumption was saying, we don't think you're getting as good a deal anymore, that we think what you pay to live there isn't worth the earnings you can get. And that's been debated. There's lots of good literature on that. But that's why we often look at data that's looking at how expensive a place is relative to incomes. And the other thing that broke our last few years has been what is small but influential in certain places. The remote work thing is real. Still a minority of American workers, but it's still a tripling of the number of people who are full-time remote work from where we were in 2019. So it's a real increase, but it's something like 15% or so of Americans. And so in small and mid-sized cities, they've been really hit by that. I mentioned I was in Bozeman, Montana last week, which would be kind of like a classic example. Relatively small city, 50,000 people. You suddenly add 500 to 1,000 high wage earners into a relative, like that transforms a housing market. And so, Victor, that might be like a little bit of almost like the opposite side. Some of the larger markets have been able to absorb differently. We see kind of the Austin and the DC narrative is a few zip codes have suddenly flipped, and they're the ones that have seen housing declines because they've built faster relative to population share. So to wrap this up and get some reaction, I think for most of my career in entrepreneurial ecosystem building, housing was only ever seen as a good in the places I was hanging, because it was always like the default assumption was it's cheaper here, it's a strength of ours. I have now, in the last 3 to 5 years, been in the ecosystems that I'm surprised suddenly they're talking about housing being a drag for them relative to what they can offer. To Brian's point of like, are we offering enough of an entrepreneur if the housing cheapness isn't cheap enough, if that makes sense? Like that like the value prop, has it been shook? So maybe that's the better way for me to ask it. Do ecosystems have to bring housing changes into their value prop for the entrepreneurs they're trying to retain, grow, or even attract?
Well, the obviously beautiful places like Montana and the mountains and Idaho, they've had huge run-ups during, triggered by COVID, and remote workers, they obviously want to hang, it's not bad to hang out and look at beautiful mountains, when you're not working. But I was just in Kansas City a few weeks ago. Housing has gone up, but it's still not insane. And Kansas City is a good mid-sized city entrepreneurial ecosystem, and there's a number of cities like that in a lot of places. So I think it's a case where there's places which have gone nuts, and there's other places which are still kind of sane. Like in the map you were showing, there's still swaths of the country that are relatively healthy. But I think a lot of people, But it's true, in the big cities, you do get the richness of the sheer number of people, like the economies of scale, of access to talent and information and capital and resources. And that's hard to match in a smaller place. And so the smaller places have to work extra hard to meet that.
Rae'Mah, do you think, or do you know, are there good people of Birmingham who are making different life choices because of those housing cost changes? And I'm not forcing it. I mean it pretty genuinely.
Yeah. Well, I think the part that it probably affects the most is that, like, when you have the average salary in Alabama is like around $50,000 a year. So when you suddenly housing prices are like going up, apartment prices are going up, you are pushing people out into rural areas, or just like the displacement I've been able to realize up close in my own neighborhood is an apartment complex going bankrupt. Those apartments were around $500 a month. And so where is that person who's suddenly been displaced now going to find a place to live? So I think that's where most of our major impact is at, in reference to like pricing increases. We happen to be very lucky. I think our housing community, it was reported a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3, that we had a homeless population like less than 1,000 people. So it's not a huge issue for us. I think our issue is that once we do bring entrepreneurs here, we do have really affordable housing. We don't have the hospitality for a founder that's looking here. We don't have a robust VC ecosystem. A lot of our VCs, no shade to anyone who probably could see this live, but like some of them are like more so very risk averse, as far as, and you almost approach them, it's like having a conversation with the bank lender, and so those are the things that we're having to like battle in our ecosystem, at least I can say here in the South, because it's like, hey Chris, I want you to come start your next startup in rural Jackson, Mississippi, or something, like like the trade-off is like, do I want to be in a city like that? Is that the culture that I want to be engrossed in? And I think it's a little bit different for Birmingham. I think we have a little mix of perfection. I like to joke that we are just a modern Andy Griffith show. Like, we're just out of state. So that we were able to win people over with culture in that way. But I don't know, we're more so missing the fundamentals on like, what is it? You can live here and you can afford here and you can actually find reasonable cost of like labor here when it comes to hiring people. But is it where you want to build?
Brian, I'm gonna come to you as a guy. I know you've had that conversation with founders in your portfolio or outside about like, it's a little cheaper over here, but XYZ and amenity, either cultural or entrepreneurial, is more vibrant over there. The obvious answer is like there's a spectrum, right? Of course, the different people are going to make different choices, but just maybe walk us through how you might talk with that founder about choosing between going back home where maybe there's fewer entrepreneurs like me, but I can save a lot, as opposed to, that there are a lot of meetups where I'm going to meet other smart people and engage in a different way, and I'm going to pay a lot more for rent. What's your guidance as you talk someone through that?
Well, inherent in the question and our panels is that entrepreneurs moving to a town is a good thing, not a bad thing. I mean, there's no greater set of gentrifiers than entrepreneurial startup founders, right? I'll speak for myself. When I moved to Miami, I moved to a neighborhood. I was the only non-Haitian person in Little Haiti. There's 5 houses on my short block. And the rest of them use the bodega. The rest of them work, me, I'm using Uber Eats. I'm getting Amazon delivery, right? I'm not using the dry cleaner, right? I'm getting the whole 9, right?
You're crushing the bodega, Brian.
I get your point.
Then I go out evangelizing about how great Miami is. By the time I left that spot, 4 of the 5 families were not Haitian. They were all new, right? So there is an issue there too around, are we helping the community side of these communities by moving so many people into them?
That's good.
So, Victor, let me go to you. Talk to me about what kind of policy and interventions you've seen at the local level. Like, because I think what Brian is saying really smartly there, or what I pick up from that, is there are different kinds of entrepreneurs. And Victor, you're a smart fella, so you're often talking about the entrepreneur who's invested in her community and she's digging in, and that's the entrepreneur vision you have, which might not be the VC backed, fully remote. I'm just whatever cliche you'd have. So what, for your version of entrepreneurship, what's kind of housing policy stuff that you're thinking about that keeps entrepreneurs in a community, lets them dig in, and changes how they think about housing?
Well, there's a few things. One is around home lending. This is actually a big issue, and I've encountered this issue, and I found out in some of my travels, I started to talk to entrepreneurs about it. It's an issue for a lot of entrepreneurs, which is that the entire home mortgage system is based on W-2s and payroll jobs. And if you're starting out a new business, you could be killing it. You could be making a ton of money. You could even have a high net worth. You could have a lot of cash in the bank. But to get a mortgage, the banks don't care. All they care about is whether you're payrolled and getting a W-2, which makes no sense at all, because a W-2 can be fired tomorrow as well. It's not like a W-2 is inherently safer. And so we have an entire mortgage system that's based on W-2s, which is basically discriminatory against entrepreneurs, even successful entrepreneurs. And I've talked to so many entrepreneurs, and they get kind of riled up about this. They're like, oh yeah, I had to deal with that. It made no sense at all. And I had to deal with that too. I was trying to do a refinance when I'd left the W-2 job, and I'd started something new. I could have just paid off my entire mortgage with cash, but I wanted to get a low interest rate, and I could not refinance because I just started a new business. And I started to dig into it, and I started asking people about this question, and lots of people have dealt with something like this. It makes no sense at all.
Can I, before you go on, like, to plus one, because yes, I had the same personal experience. I'll do you one worse. My memory and interpretation of my own frustration with it was I was W-2'd at technically the organization that I owned. But because I showed a majority ownership, I was guided that, like, it doesn't matter. They were viewing it as employment. I was like, that doesn't make any sense. I am a W-2. Like, I'm a W-2 employee. You told me you need a W-2. I have a W-2. I am a W-2. And it was still overwritten. And I had the same logic of, like, that's bizarre to me, because at minimum, I will know if I'm going to be fired before anyone. So I'm the first one to know if I'm going to be fired. Sounds like I'm the exact kind of person. So I've had a lot of issues on that exact point. It's super interesting. I've never heard anyone talk about it as a policy thing to confront.
We should talk about it as a home lending discrimination against entrepreneurs. I mean, it really is. Yeah. A few other issues that there's been a lot of movement, especially COVID triggered it, around letting you use your homes for starting up businesses. And so there's a number of cities and counties and even states now that are lowering bars, like having to license home businesses when no one cares. Like, if you're a remote worker, who cares? But the old state laws actually said you had to get a permit and a license just to operate out of your kitchen, or your bedroom. And there's laws around even operating micro enterprise home kitchens, MICO laws, that are starting to emerge now in California and Utah, where you could actually serve people like small scale restaurants in your home. And this makes a lot of sense, because there's a lot of people trying this out, and the laws have been really hard to build out full restaurants. So anyways, a lot of experimentation happening, and it's good to see that.
If I could double click on that, I think there's a lot of work going on at the states to remove some of this local control over these mini issues, because things don't get done, because you have these small boards only for one town that say no ADU for you, right? And then now you don't have a home office, right? But it's your land, you bought it, there's plenty of space, right? It's just like they're so worried about the Airbnb phenomenon that they actually hurt kind of everyone else. It's got to be. I like what I'm seeing from Massachusetts and other places where they're saying, hey, you know what? We're going to take some of these controls out of the hands of these local boards and kind of set state standards people can follow.
Can we? Oh, go ahead, Rae'Mah. Sorry.
I just, when Brian mentioned the ADUs, it's so interesting when you say, oh, you have plenty of land and you can add those things in. It just made me quickly remember just around the current. One thing I will say I'm noticing as a shift currently in Alabama, maybe it's more so relevant to Alabama, but you guys see how sexy these new manufactured homes are coming out? And so when we think about affordable housing, like, well, hey, I don't need, damn that other house that's, listed for $250,000. Let me go buy a $10,000 plot of land, put this manufactured home on it. And so what we're experiencing now is they're all being written out. Like, they cannot sell basically those manufactured homes, because the laws are now becoming so stringent of not wanting those in our cities. I don't know if that's because it's a preference for curb appeal of anything that nature, but that is something that is I wouldn't say is maybe directly affecting entrepreneurs, of course, but in our local ecosystem, that is something that's been very interesting to watch. And now pushing everyone to very, very rural areas or even undeclared areas in order to use that as a means of living.
You can buy a ADU at Costco. I actually saw that. Like, so,
oh, is that right?
And they actually look pretty nice. Like, it's not like the old, manufactured homes of 30 years ago when they were pretty cringe, which is a young person phrase. I learned that. But you can get nice looking ADU like that, right? It's kind of cool looking. And Costco, Costco ADU, just like that. So
yeah,
remarkable.
So let's dig into a couple things I hear you guys picking up. One is essentially like value prop, like kind of basic supply and demand. There's in some sense a logic. I can remember being teased once when I was, 15 years ago, rejoicing about the low cost of living at a given city, and someone was like, "Because no one wants to live there, you dummy." And I remember like, "Oh, okay, all right." And in the simplest form, there's a degree of truth to that, right? Like they're gonna in the most distilled down version, amount of housing and the amount of people pursuing that housing is going to drive the cost. And so we're kind of hit on that, like how many either cultural amenities, more generally, nice place to live, a bunch of these factors, and more targeted ones around what we'd call entrepreneurship, which I think a lot of times we mean like, is there a vibe? Is there a community? Is there a tribe? Is there a narrative? Is there like a sense of I'm gonna be with my people? And so in some sense, you would say we're going to expect a degree of cost variation in a big market like the United States, and you're going to pick your own choices. Like, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for proximity to a certain kind of entrepreneur, and you're willing to pay anything? And there's data that over the time that has often been a good decision. That more often, if you were to relocate, if you were the scrappy software engineer in the 2010s, you should have probably gone to SF. It probably would have been, if you wanted to just maximize earnings, the research shows that probably was what you should have done. But of course, not everyone's trying to maximize earnings. You might be maximizing other things, and that's why this comes up. I guess the reason we're talking a lot about housing right now is that simplified version of the story has gotten more complicated of late. We saw, I think the Austin housing story is one of the things that I find most interesting, because the Austin housing story sometimes is covered like it's covering the stock market. Oh, there's a crisis because housing prices have gone down. And there's some wrinkle to the story, but like part of the story was a lot of housing was built in the boom time and it outpaced the number of people moving there. And I keep seeing these stories and I'm like, I don't know if I want to treat that as bad news. Like, I don't know why, but we've almost like unhealthily linked house prices with like any asset. Oh, if the asset's going down, it must be bad. As opposed to this like kind of more commodity price of sometimes eggs are worth more or less. And we probably don't want your whole net worth to be based on the egg collection you have. So I guess just like, talk to me a bit about like, I don't know. I want entrepreneur boosters to be loud about the housing costs in their ecosystem relative to the value they can provide. And I want to make sure I'm not forcing the issue, but I see this as like a great story for Austin, that actually, guys, you can't say we followed the same path as Seattle. Austin is lower cost relative to the value it offers its entrepreneurs than Seattle is. I think Austin's value prop is stronger than Seattle because of that. But that's not always how it's talked about. It's sometimes talked about as a problem inherent in Austin right now.
Well, as someone whose parents live in Austin, and I grew up, part of my youth in Austin. What you're saying is it's right from an affordability standpoint. The thing about volatility is a lot of people are caught up in that. Like they get stuck. Like they bought houses at the peak, and now they're stuck with heavy mortgages, or they've had huge swings in volatility, and it's hard to plan around that. And actually, my family's had to deal with that in Austin because the house prices have fallen so fast, which is correcting itself. It did get overblown. I mean, prices went up like in some neighborhoods, like close to 10x, like in just a few years, which like there's no planet where that makes sense long term. but it makes it hard to plan. Like if you're trying to change homes, like my parents trying to deal with like post-retirement housing issues. Like it's hard to plan like selling. So price volatility is just hard to live with, right? And I think what we all really should strive for is sort of slower curves. So when things happen, there's the problem with housing is it takes time to build housing. And so, booms in Austin, they started building, and then they built too fast, and then people started leaving. Some people started leaving, and then things kind of got out of whack. So it's hard to plan around this stuff. But you really, ideally, don't want that kind of volatility. It's hard to live with.
Yeah, that's well said. So, Rae'Mah, Brian, like maybe the tactical thing I'm thinking about is I was in an ecosystem. Kind of like, post-it note session, as we all have been 10,000 times. And maybe I've just done too many of them and I shouldn't be invited anymore. But like one of the prompts was, how do we attract and retain more entrepreneurs? And I was just like, housing. The answer is housing. Because from my reporting career in those 2010s, like Philadelphia, where I live, is one of these examples, but there's a dozen of these cities that had great 2010s, the decade. And it tended to be because they captured a big share of immigrant movements, and they retain more of their college graduates, that millennial cohort. And that's a Philadelphia story, but it's a bunch of cities. Atlanta has some of this too. There's a bunch of cities that was the story of the 2010s, immigrants and millennials. And when you look at the survey data, it's housing. Why did they stay? Housing. Those cities were relatively good places to live and relatively affordable to other options. And so that was what powered those cities in the 2010s. And many of the ecosystem conversations we're having now in the 2020s, I think, are baked on housing decisions made a decade ago. And now I think, how will that play out next? I think it's like a wrestling right now about who will be living where. And I think there is a question of like, okay, can Birmingham have a strong enough ecosystem relative to its housing costs that it's seen as a good deal? And then if we're going to get people to come into Techstars, if I'm an economic development org of Alabama, my math has got to be I have to have enough amenities to make it valuable while housing is still seen as a good deal. And if either is imbalanced, right, like too expensive and not enough offering, or not enough offering, but like it's too expensive, it gets out of whack. And so I know most ecosystem builders is not thinking about housing. It's seen as too macro. It's seen as too kind of over there. But I think I'm arguing that I think more entrepreneur support orgs, and I know economic development orgs are thinking about this, but should have housing in the back of their mind. And maybe, Rae'Mah, I'm thinking of you because you did say that is part of something you guys are talking about when folks are coming into town. Oh, you're muted. Is that just me?
No, sorry. I had some noise in the hallway. Yeah. Actually, no, it's actually really interesting because a couple years ago, our Techstars 2021 class, I actually feel like when we bring people to Birmingham, like, oh, I got to move to Birmingham. And I'm joking about them now. I hope that some of my founders are going to watch. I'm like, I was never that down to it, but I've had founders come from like New York and they're like, man, I drove here and I didn't come across no dirt roads. It was like crazy. And so it's like, once we get here, I think the sell for us, especially because we're so close to Atlanta, we're just a 2-hour drive to Atlanta, is like, oh, well, why build in Birmingham rather than just build in a larger city that's actually relatively close? Is I think we really like lean in on our like intrinsic value and our community. That's something we do really, really, really well. When I said like we're like the modern evolved version of the Andy Griffin Show, it's so real. You can come to any networking event and I could be like, oh my God, Brian, it's so good to see you. I got this new founder in town. Could you introduce him to like the power delivery folks over at Alabama Power? That'd be so great. Like there's that our Southern charm is actually what's really helping us win, that Southern hospitality. And it's so much so we, I said this earlier, but to actually close the loop on it, our Techstars 2021 class, they fell in love so much with Birmingham just based off the experience of the community. They bought a house about 10 minutes away from the office and they turned it into an entrepreneurship house. It's called Be Home. It's phenomenal. And so all of the accelerators around town, when we're trying to recruit people to actually stay here in Birmingham, we're like, oh my God, we already got a place for you to stay. Here's Be Home. She's a former Techstars alumni. It's alumni that run all entrepreneurs and founders that live there. You instantly will have community. You know, building a company is lonely. You know, this is a house that'll instantly give you camaraderie. And so it's been really interesting to see our ecosystem like really support. Yeah, that's them right there. I'm just going to show this to Sophie. She's going to be so excited. But it's affordable for a founder, especially coming from a large city. I think they're priced anywhere between $1,500 to $1,800, like all in. They have parties. They go to karaoke together. They have game nights, you know, and things of that nature. Okay, inflation. So the prices have gone slightly up, but.
But sure. No, I think so. This is actually super interesting, Rae'Mah. Let me dig in on this for a sec. And Victor, Brian, maybe, I don't know if you guys, I can remember, maybe I should dig up the archives, but I remember technically stories in like at least a couple of our markets of bad versions of this.
Yeah.
So like, you know, bro fest at the beach house kind of thing. Real world meets Series A financing, like everything, every nightmare you can imagine happening. And that was a different era. But now this seems to be in response. We've seen lots of adaptive reuses. You guys mentioned ADUs a bunch earlier, accessory dwelling units, but we've seen, we've covered a bit like the daycare entrepreneur merging with the retirement home entrepreneur, like trying to be responsive to moments we have, difficult access to early child education, people wanting to age in place, mixed use housing that wants to have intergenerational dynamics. Like there's a mess of housing issues that spiral into different places that I've seen entrepreneurs trying to respond. And so it's interesting that Birmingham has an example of a housing entrepreneur, and good shout out, Rae'Mah, like, because this in this sense is for entrepreneurs, but wouldn't necessarily have to be, right? Like there could be other,
yeah,
you know, versions.
There's regular people who've lived there. And you know, it's so interesting. When they opened this house, there was all those stories spinning out about like, this is bad, it's super dangerous, it's a huge liability, you know, all these different things. And so it's been amazing to see them actually do it really well and it be long lasting. I think it turns like 2 years old this year.
Victor, we're gonna jump in.
Well, I'll say that the name Bee House is fantastic. What a clever name, right? I get it. Birmingham, and then it's also B. It's like B. It's like your B home.
Yeah.
B home. It's like really nice. Interestingly, I just remembered, because I've been around a long time in this work. A few decades back, cost was really the only way that a town could attract people to move to some of the mid-sized cities or smaller cities. And now to talk about hospitality is actually a whole new angle. That was not part of the spin 20 years ago. They're cheaper, and then the response was, well, it's cheaper for a reason. But now to say you can have a community and everyone's here to greet you, and you're still connected to the whole world, that's a whole different sales proposition than it used to have. So I will say, in the big cities, I think by and large, most people still don't know. They kind of tend to, like you were saying, Rae'Mah, they like think there's dirt roads and all that. And they think Kansas City is still like cow farms and whatever. And most people in the major metro areas that have not gotten out still think in stereotypes about some of these places. But the sales pitch about this, and I've seen this now in a lot of places, from Birmingham to KC. KC has got a whole boomerang program to bring people back to KC. They call it. Fargo, North Dakota has got a whole program to welcome people there. Once people get there, a lot of people love it way more than they think. And I think a big part of it is the disconnectedness of modern life. And you know, you can live in LA or San Francisco and just be on your computer all day. But if you go to other places, you can actually have a community and a home. So that's a real selling point.
You'll be shocked to learn, Victor, that I see it as a storytelling challenge, that people have not overtaken the narrative about their place.
They should hire a service or a company that does this for them.
I do think people are always like, well, why don't people think about us differently? It's because they haven't heard anything from you since 1987. So that's what they know about you.
I do want to warn for ecosystems that are thinking like about affordability, and I'll put this in the chat for you to share, Chris. Even the hot cities are building an insane number of units. They are following the Austin model. There are 50,000 units under construction right now, simultaneous in Miami, which is a top 10 ecosystem, right?
Yep.
So if you build your whole value prop on cost, and then the bigger ecosystems drive down costs like Austin has, you lose it. So to your last point, It's got to be storytelling. It's got to be placemaking. It's got to be family. It's got to be other things, because cost is just a variable that you cannot control.
Well said. Well, and I think that's like my takeaway on this topic is I think my shove on ecosystem builders is it's part of the equation. That like, yes, you what is most in your control is the community you have of entrepreneurs, and the narrative people know about that community. But there's this other part of it, and it will be this tension of whether people know it or not. They're implicitly always saying, is there enough value here for the cost to be there? And for many decades in Philadelphia, our superstar cities remained superstars because whatever you wanted to say about how expensive they were, the value prop was strong. You would earn out for paying more. It made sense to be in the kind of jokey 6 people in a 3-bedroom. Like that was smart. And right now we're in a moment where that's unsure. And Brian, your point is right on. This is something I talked with folks in Montana about, because now Bozeman in particular, a small city of 50,000, but with an enormous, federal investment in photonics, like really cutting edge research happening. They have a flood of serious technologists and entrepreneurs. You're right, Brian, that they now have lost their chance to talk about affordability long ago, years in the making. And now it's DC, it's Austin, it's Miami, it's other like big hubs that they've dealt with expense for so long that they are now trying to build their way out of it. And some of them are getting ahead of that curve. And suddenly actually that housing tip might be like, well, actually it's Miami and it's not as expensive as wherever. One last little plug on the research side before I'm gonna have to wrap you guys up in a second. Shout out to a book came out earlier this year, Stuck by Yoni Applebaum, on what we would call the housing crisis. But I think the thing that most feels relevant to me for our conversation is his real argument is we should see it less as a housing crisis than a mobility crisis, that Americans are moving less, which is a decades in the making story. And that, Victor, something I've seen you talk about too, because ultimately we wanted Americans to move because typically movement was a signal of income earnings. You just find a new tribe. And when we aren't moving, we tend to lose some of that dynamism. And actually, Victor, is there like a right to start line on that? I haven't heard you recently on the like, we want Americans to
There's not an official right to start line on it, but it is something I think is really important, because when you move is when you shake things up. You meet new people, you get new perspectives, you see the world differently. And I my own personal belief is a big part of the reason this country is a bit more polarized, a lot more polarized, is because people, they think in stereotypes about each other. And so if you don't go to, and it goes in all directions, right? In smaller towns, they think of big cities as a whole certain type of person, and people in big cities think of smaller places as a whole type of person. And the truth is, in all my travels, I've never met anyone that was only a stereotype. Like everyone is their own person. Everyone is nuanced. Everyone's complex. Every city, every community is complex and nuanced. And we operate in stereotypes. And it's easy when you don't travel to places to believe the media lines about like, oh, not this media, but other media lines about, those people are like this, right? People in Silicon Valley are all like that, or people in Birmingham are all another way. And it's just not true. It's never true. And how could it be true, right? Human beings are just too complicated to be so simple like that.
All right, Rae'Mah, I'm about to head out. Final remarks from you before I close this.
Welcome to Rae'Mah. It's going to be a great time. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so thrilled to have you, Rae'Mah.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here. I am so excited, and I hope to be able to join you guys again in the future.
I love that. I think a word that I want to leave us out on, Victor, builds on yours, that the head start that many regions got in the 2010s are building ecosystems is gone. That every state, every region has something like an entrepreneurial engagement strategy, something about a workforce technology innovation strategy. The head start's over, and now it is everyone. And so to your point, like, stop your stereotypes of what you think about any given state having an entrepreneurial community. They do. And so now the question is how do we best accelerate that work? And we'll be talking about it here on Builders Live. Victor, Brian, Rae'Mah, thanks so much for the time. See you next time, everybody. Bye.
Bye. you.